Hello, my friends, and welcome back. Today I want to tell you a story about silence. Not the gentle hush that falls when daylight fades, but the heavy kind. The kind that settles on a man's chest like solid rock. This is a story about a place called Lone Mesa, about the shadows people carry inside them, and about the strange, stubborn way life can still take root, even in the driest dust. Let me carry you back to the year 1884. If you had ridden across the lands surrounding Lone Mesa in those days, the first thing you would have noticed was the quiet. It was a silence so dense it felt etched into the red stone itself. Days there stretched long and merciless. The sun burned down until the world stiffened into brittle stillness, baking the ground until the air shimmered and wavered with heat. And when the sun finally slipped behind the horizon, the cold crept in fast, bringing with it the lonely cries of coyotes echoing from distant ridgelines. The mesa rose like an island in a sea of sand and yucca, its cliffs standing watch over a plain where little dared to grow. It was harsh land, relentless, and that was exactly where Toma chose to build his ranch. Toma lived there alone. He was quiet, untouchable, like a man shaped from the same stone that sheltered his home. He was 33 years old then, young by most measures. But if you looked closely at his face, you would see the weight of a man twice that age. He was Apache by blood and bone, though the government in Santa Fe had long tried to bind him with papers and treaties. But paper could not change a man's spirit, nor could it mend the hollow look settled deep in his dark eyes. His skin was weathered by sun and wind, his hair hung long, tied back, and he moved through the world with careful restraint, always guarded. The few neighbors who lived miles away, those who rarely passed his gate, called him a ghost in his own land. And the hard truth was, they weren't wrong. Toma had not always been this way. There was a time when laughter had echoed off canyon walls, a time when the ranch felt like a beginning, not an ending. But that was before. 2 winters earlier, Toma had buried his wife Sarah and his young son Ben after a ruthless fever swept through the valley. The sickness came fast and showed no mercy. Toma, a man strong enough to break wild horses and mend fences with bare hands, found himself utterly powerless. Imagine that, my friends. Hands capable of building a home from raw earth, yet helpless against a shadow no rifle and no blade could fight. He watched the fever take them. And when it finally passed, it carried away the light of his life with it. After that, Toma spoke little. He lived quieter. He kept to his labor, burying grief in the steady rhythm of daily work. The house he had built still stood firm. The corral posts remained straight and solid. But the man inside had been hollow stone for 2 long years. This was how he survived. He rose before dawn, worked until his muscles screamed, slept only when exhaustion dragged him under. He ate just enough to remain upright. Jerked meat, hard biscuits, coffee boiled black and bitter. Food was fuel, nothing more. He did not look for comfort. He did not seek company. He simply endured. But even a man carved from stone will fracture under complete isolation. It wasn't that Toma wanted conversation. It was that the house had grown too empty, even for him. The silence had become something physical, wrapping around the place like a burial shroud. And so, a few weeks before this story truly begins, Toma did something unexpected. He took a rough plank of wood and a branding iron. As the smell of burned timber filled the air, he seared a few plain words into the board. Help wanted. Cooking. Care for stock. He carried the sign to the edge of his land, near the wagon road where dust never fully settled, and nailed the weathered plank to a post. Then he stepped back and waited. He never nailed that sign up because he truly believed someone would answer it. Who would ride this far, to the very edge of nowhere, just to work for a silent, broken man? Number. He put it up because the emptiness inside the house had grown louder than the wind outside. Weeks slipped by. Riders passed the sign without slowing. They took one look at the barren land, the lonely house, and kept moving. And Toma watched them go. He stood on the porch with his arms crossed, hat pulled low, eyes sharp and unreadable, like a desert hawk circling high above. He expected nothing. He expected the silence to stretch on forever. Unexpected. Unsettling. And just like that, the hollow man was no longer entirely alone. The silence of Lone Mesa was about to shift. There is a sound a wagon makes when it has traveled too far across the high desert. A dry, rhythmic complaint, wood grinding against iron, wheels protesting the unforgiving earth. On that early spring afternoon, the sound cut straight through Lone Mesa's quiet, announcing an arrival the land itself had not asked for. The air was dry, carrying the sharp, sweet scent of mesquite and dust. The woman holding the reins sat upright, even as her horse told a different story. The animal was little more than ribs and hide, head hanging low with every step, beaten down by the relentless sun. But the woman, she did not bow. She looked to be around 30, dark hair pulled back beneath a plain bonnet worn thin by time. Her face was pale from the trial of the road, dusty and drawn. Yet beneath that layer of travel weariness lived a quiet strength. Her dress was simple, the hem frayed from dragging through endless miles of grit and dirt. She brought the cart to a stop beside the weathered sign Toma had nailed up weeks earlier. She climbed down from the cart. Her boots met the ground with a firmness that spoke of long roads and harder days. She didn't study the dirt. She looked up. She took in the house, timbers warped by wind, a porch sagging under years of neglect, windows dulled and clouded with age. Most folks would have seen a ruin, a place where hope had dried up and blown away. But she didn't turn back. She squared her shoulders, drew a breath of thin desert air, and walked toward the porch where Toma stood waiting. He had been watching her for a mile, arms folded, hat pulled low, eyes sharp and unreadable, like the hawk circling the blue sky overhead. He was a man who had forgotten how to welcome anyone, a man who wore solitude like armor. "You the owner?" she asked. Her voice was steady, though roughened by dust and distance. Toma gave a curt nod. "Name's Toma." She paused for a single beat, then met his eyes. "Mae Calder. I saw the sign." His gaze flicked to the plank nailed to the post, then back to her face. He didn't want this. Didn't want the interruption. "Plenty of folks ride past that sign," he said, warning plain in his tone. "I didn't," she replied. The silence stretched between them. Wind pressed against the porch boards, making them groan. Somewhere in the brush, a grasshopper kept time with a steady click. It was a standoff between two people who had forgotten how softness sounded. At last, Toma broke it. "You no stuck? Cooking?" Mae lifted her chin. "I do. And I work hard." He studied her closely. He looked past the dust on her clothes, searching for something behind her calm stare. He saw the exhaustion, yes, but he saw something else too. Sorrow, packed deep, buried the same way his own was. It was a look he knew well. one he met every morning in the mirror. "Don't need trouble here," he said flatly. "I've had enough of it." She answered without raising her voice. Her voice stayed low, but it didn't waver. "All I'm asking for is honest work." That honesty landed harder than anything else she'd said. Toma looked past her to the cart. One trunk, one mandolin case tied down beside it. That was all. Everything she owned in the world. Not much of a life packed into wood and leather, he thought, and then his mind drifted back to his own house. The cold stove, the empty rooms, the endless quiet wrapped around the place like a burial cloth. He stood there a long moment. Finally, he lifted a hand and gestured toward the house. "Kitchen's round back. Side rooms are empty. Pumps by the well." Mae Calder gave a slight nod. "That'll do just fine." There was no handshake, no smile. Just two strangers facing each other across a hollow threshold neither had truly crossed in years. Mae turned back to the cart to retrieve her trunk. Toma watched her. He didn't step forward to help, maybe out of habit. Maybe because something in him knew she wouldn't take it. She hoisted the heavy trunk herself and carried it across the porch with a steady stride. And then it happened. A small thing. A nothing thing. As she passed him on the narrow boards, her skirt brushed against his coat for a single heartbeat. Barely worth noticing, yet to a man who had turned himself to stone. To a man who hadn't felt another person's closeness in 2 long winters. It felt electric. A spark in dry grass. Unexpected. Unsettling. Dangerous. Inside, the house was dim. The air lay stale and unmoving. Curtains hung limp, heavy with dust. The floorboards creaked beneath Mae's boots as she stepped into the gloom. She stopped and looked around. She saw the emptiness, yes, but where others might have seen ruin, she saw possibility, the bare bones of a home waiting to be cared for. She carried her trunk into the side room and set it down. Her fingers brushed the rough wood of the dresser. Solid. Real. Shelter. She didn't linger. Mae returned to the kitchen, where the stove sat cold and dark. She glanced at Toma, who had followed only as far as the doorway. "Do you have coffee?" she asked. He blinked, as if pulled out of a distant place. "Beans in the jar by the shelf." She untied her bonnet, shook the dust loose from her hair, and went to work without another word. She filled the kettle at the pump, measured the beans, struck a match. Soon the crackle of flame broke the stillness. It wasn't the careless fire of a man just keeping warm. It was deliberate, intentional. The sound of a hearth being brought back to life. A faint, rich smell began to spread, coffee rising into the air. Toma stood in the doorway watching. It felt strange. It had been years since another person had moved through that kitchen with purpose. Years since the house had held sounds that weren't his alone. Mae didn't chatter. She didn't pry. She worked in quiet confidence, the way someone does who understands silence. And without meaning to, Toma found himself leaning against the doorframe longer than he should have, drawn to the steady rhythm of her hands. When the coffee was ready, she poured 2 cups. She set one on the table, across from her own, without asking if he wanted it. Then she sat. Toma looked down at the cup. Steam curled up from the dark liquid. He lifted his eyes to her. She met his gaze calmly. No smile. It wasn't warmth, not yet. It was recognition. The unspoken understanding shared by 2 people who had lost more than they ever put into words. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. The mesa stood vast and unmoving. But inside, for the first time in a long while, Toma felt the air in his house shift, just enough to know something had entered Lone Mesa with the woman called Mae Calder. And though neither of them said it aloud as they sat there drinking bitter coffee, they both knew the silence had changed. It was no longer empty. It was waiting. The next morning, dawn broke over Lone Mesa, a pale wash of light spilling across the desert floor. The air cut sharp with cold, the kind of high desert chill that settles deep into the bones before the sun can soften it. Toma rose early, just as he always did. He pulled on his boots and stepped out toward the corral. He expected silence. For 2 years, that was all he had known. The shuffle of hooves, the rattle of wind, the steady thud of his own heart. But as he stepped off the porch, he stopped. The house behind him was not quiet. A faint clatter reached his ears, metal against wood. Then the low hiss of a fire being coaxed awake. He frowned and glanced back at the chimney. For the first time in years, smoke was curling into the sky before he had lit the fire himself. When he came back inside after finishing his chores, the smell hit him all at once. Coffee, strong enough to wake the dead. Bread warming near the hearth. And beneath it, the faint, earthy scent of herbs simmering in a pot. The table, long bare for as long as he could remember, was set. A plate of biscuits rested on a clean cloth. Mae Calder stood at the stove. Her sleeves were rolled up, her hair tied back, moving with quiet efficiency. She turned when she heard his heavy boots cross the floor. "You're back early," she said, casual, as if he'd only stepped out for the afternoon. Toma looked at the table, then at her. Suspicion wrestled with something dangerously close to wonder. "You didn't have to cook," he said. She answered gently, not lifting her eyes from her work. "I did. A house can't breathe without it." He hesitated, then pulled out a chair and sat. Mae poured a cup of coffee and slid it across the table to him. He raised it to his lips. The first taste nearly startled him. It was strong, bitter, alive. It had been too many winters since Toma had eaten a proper breakfast. Sarah used to make meals like this: venison stew, fry bread, roasted beans. After she was gone, he had eaten only to stay upright. Jerky, hardtack, food reduced to fuel, nothing more. But when Mae set a plate of scrambled eggs and warm bread in front of him, something stirred. He picked up his fork, slowly, almost uncertain. Mae sat across from him with a modest plate of her own. She didn't chatter. She didn't crowd the silence with words. She simply ate. She glanced at him once, as if waiting to see whether he would refuse the offering. He didn't. He ate every bite. And when the bread was gone, he leaned back and let out a long breath. "There's more in the pot if you want," she said, a faint smile touching her mouth. Toma shook his head. "It's enough." Silence settled between them. But it wasn't the silence from the day before. It didn't weigh like stone. It rested easy, like the quiet between two people sharing a table. And so the days began to find a rhythm. Mae rose before the sun, filling the kitchen with warmth. Toma returned from the corral to the smell of something simmering. He never asked her to do it. She never asked his permission. When the work grew heavy, she didn't stay inside. She stepped into it. She hauled water to the troughs, scattered grain for the chickens. One afternoon, Toma found her along the fence line, a hammer in her hand, setting right a leaning post. He watched for a moment, frowning at the sight of her laboring in the dust. But she finished the job, clean and sure. "You didn't have to," he said again. Mae wiped her hands on her apron and met his gaze. "Neither did you when you built this place." "But you did."
Toma had no answer for that. One evening, after a long day riding the range, Toma came back coated in dust and fatigue. As he stepped inside, he stopped short. The door to the side room where Mae Calder slept stood half open. From within, the warm glow of lamplight spilled into the hall.
He caught a glimpse of her, bent over her small trunk, a mandolin resting in her lap. Her fingers moved gently across the strings, picking out a simple tune. A lullaby, maybe. The sound drifted down the hallway, soft and careful, wrapping around him before he realized it. He hadn't heard music in this house since Sarah's voice had fallen silent. He stood there longer than he intended, listening. Then he turned away without a sound. The next morning, he left something on the kitchen table. It was a knife with a carved handle, shaped by his own hands years earlier. He said nothing about it, but when he came in that evening, he saw that Mae had placed it on the windowsill, with the last light of day caught along the blade. She didn't mention it. Neither did he. That was how their quiet exchange began. He would leave small things, a pouch of dried berries, a carved hairpin, a handful of yucca seeds. She never tucked them away. She found places for them, set them where they mattered. In return, she left signs for him, an extra biscuit wrapped in cloth near his saddle, a sprig of mint resting on the windowsill. They spoke little, but in those wordless gestures, the house slowly began to fill. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the mesa gold, Toma paused at the fence line. A shadow moved along the far ridge. It was the wild Mustang he had seen before. A gray stallion with a mane like storm clouds, proud and unreachable. The horse had roamed the land for months, never allowing a man close, never lingering in one place for long. Mae came up beside him, wiping her hands on her skirt. She stood quietly, watching the animal. "He's beautiful," she said. Toma grunted softly. "Wild. You can't break a horse like that." "He comes and goes as he pleases." Mae watched the stallion toss his head, sunlight catching along his neck. A faint smile touched her lips. "Maybe it isn't meant to be broken," she said softly. "Maybe it just needs someone patient enough to wait." Toma looked at her then, longer than he should have. Something in her words reached deeper than the horse ever could. He turned back toward the horizon, saying nothing. That night they ate together again. The lamp burned low, throwing long shadows across the walls. Toma sat with his coffee. Mae worked her needle through cloth. The silence held steady, not heavy, not lonely, but shared. At last, Mae spoke into it. "I know you didn't plan on me being here," she said. "And I know I stepped in where I wasn't asked. If it's too much—" Toma cut her off, his voice rough but not unkind. "It's not." She looked up, surprised. He met her eyes across the table. For the first time, his gaze held no guard. "It's been a long time since this house felt lived in," he said. "You changed that." Mae didn't answer, but her eyes softened. She bent back over her sewing, a faint smile touching her mouth. Outside, the desert night stretched wide and dark, but inside Lone Mesa, two people sat in a silence that no longer hollowed them out. It filled them. Spring deepened across Lone Mesa, but spring here was never gentle. The desert did not welcome change with blossoms. It announced it with force. The rains came hard and sudden, riding the wind down from the high ridges like a stampede. By mid-May, the sky bruised, dark and heavy, purple with storm. Thunder rolled across the horizon like war drums, shaking the ground beneath the floorboards. Toma had sensed it building all afternoon, the way the air grew thick and heavy,
the way the stock went uneasy and quiet. He knew what was coming.
A storm on the mesa could swallow a man whole, and he meant to have his animals safe before the sky split open. He worked fast at the corral, fingers flying, knots pulled tight, feed shed secured. Across the yard, Mae Calder stood at the wash line, pinning shirts when the first heavy drops struck the ground, kicking up small bursts of dust. Toma shouted across the yard, his voice battling the rising wind.
"Leave it! Get inside!"
Mae shook her head, clutching the damp cloth to her chest, stubborn as the land itself.
"These will be ruined," she called back.
"Better wet than gone,"
he fired back. The rain didn't wait for them to argue. It came all at once, a solid curtain of water crashing down from the sky. In moments, the world turned gray and deafening. The yard became mud beneath their boots. Toma cursed and ran for the corral. The wind had thrown the heavy gate wide open.
A steer bawled in panic, its weight pressing hard against the rails, threatening to burst free.
Toma grabbed the gate, boots sliding as he fought to shove it closed. But the wind and the animal were winning. Then he felt another weight slam in beside him. Mae. She had dropped the laundry straight into the mud without a second thought. She planted her shoulder next to his, boots sinking deep. Together they heaved. Lightning tore the sky apart.
Thunder cracked so loud it rattled their teeth. Neither flinched. Toma strained against the gate while Mae held the bar steady, giving him the second he needed to drive it home. Without a word, she broke away, sprinting for the shed where chickens flapped in terror. Toma followed, hammering a loose shutter back into place while Mae gathered the birds. The storm howled around them. Water, wind, noise in wild chaos. But inside that chaos, they moved like one. No commands, no wasted breath. Just instinct and trust. At last the corral held. The shed stood firm. Toma caught her arm and shouted over the rain, "Enough! Inside! Now!" They ran together across the yard, rain plastering clothes and skin, and burst onto the porch, breathless. They leaned against the doorframe, water pooling at their feet, chests rising and falling hard. For a long moment, neither spoke. They simply stood there, soaked through, staring out at the sheets of rain hammering the land. Then Mae laughed. It started small, breathless, almost surprised, as if the sound had slipped out before she could stop it. She pushed wet hair back from her face. "Well," she said, "that's a welcome like no other." Toma blinked at her. It wasn't the storm that caught him off guard. It was laughter in his house again. Water dripped from the brim of his hat as a half-smile tugged at his mouth. Toma looked at her, lamplight carving the hollow lines of his face.
He thought of the nights he had weathered alone, of Sarah's voice gone quiet. He didn't answer, but the look in his eyes said enough. Peace, he realized, wasn't always empty. Sometimes it had been waiting. But the desert, my friends, is a land of extremes. The relief the rain brought did not linger. That year, summer came early, heavy and unyielding. The days burned bright as polished brass.
The sun heated the mesa stones until they could blister skin, and sweat stung your eyes the moment you stepped outside. Toma worked straight through it. He repaired fence lines, pushed cattle toward higher ground where a thin ribbon of water still survived, hauled supplies in from Santa Cruz. He never spoke of the toll it took, but Mae Calder saw it. She noticed the deeper creases carved into his brow, the slower way he tugged off his boots at night. One evening, he came back later than usual. His horse was slick with sweat, dust caked thick across his shirt. Mae had left supper warming on the stove. "You've been gone since before sunrise," she said, rising to pour him coffee. "You didn't stop to eat." He shook his head and dropped heavily into the chair. Too much to be done, he rasped. Mae set the cup in front of him, studying his face. Beneath the tan, his skin looked pale. His lips were dry. When he lifted the cup, his hand shook. You're worn to the bone, she murmured. I'll be fine, he said. He forced down a swallow of coffee, then winced as if it scorched him. By nightfall, it was clear he was not fine. A cough tore through him, low, harsh, rattling. When Mae pressed her hand to his forehead as he lay on the bed, heat seared her palm. Toma, she whispered, fear sharpening in her throat. You've got a fever. He stirred, eyes half closed. Just tired, he muttered. No, a doctor's wife. And nothing she tried had saved him. She had buried him with dirt still beneath her nails, gathered from the same roots that failed him. That was the day she walked away, the day she swore never to touch it again. They had called her unlucky, cursed, and she had believed them. Now, staring down at Toma, listening to his labored breathing, that same terror clenched tight around her chest. She wanted to leave the room, to let nature take its course. It felt safer not to try than to fail again. But Toma groaned, twisting beneath the sheets. He was alone in this house, except for her. If she turned away, there would be no one. Mae rose suddenly. She filled a basin at the pump, soaked a cloth, and pressed it to his forehead, movements sharp, almost angry. You don't get to leave me too, she muttered. By dawn, she had made her choice. She stepped into the breaking light, boots crunching over gravel, and headed for the dry wash where she knew the herbs still grew. She gathered sage, yarrow, mint. Her hands trembled as she worked, but she didn't stop. Back at the kitchen table, she chopped, measured, and brewed. The scent rose sharp and bitter, the smell of her past, the smell of her pain. She poured the brew into a cup and carried it to his bedside. Toma, she said softly, lifting his head. You need to drink. He coughed, gagged, but swallowed it down. The hours dragged on, long and heavy. Mae Calder kept watch. She bowed her head in prayer, the words awkward on her tongue after so long. She sponged his arms and chest, whispering steady phrases meant to keep him tethered to the world. At last, near evening, she felt it. The heat broke. Sweat ran down his temples, not the burning kind, but the cool release of a fever loosening its grip. His breathing slowed. His body settled into real sleep. Mae sank back into the chair, exhaustion crashing over her all at once. Her hands smelled of sage and mint. Her dress was stained with sweat and broth. She closed her eyes, resting her head against the edge of the bed, and let the dark claim her. It was deep night when Toma woke again. The lantern burned low. He blinked, disoriented, until he felt a presence near his hand. Mae sat slumped in the chair, her head resting on her arm atop the mattress. He watched her for a long moment. Through the lingering haze, memories surfaced. The cool cloth on his skin, the bitter taste of herbs, her voice pulling him back. Mae, he whispered, his throat raw. She stirred, lifting her head. Her eyes were ringed with exhaustion, but when they met his, relief washed over her face. You're awake, she breathed. Toma swallowed. You. Me. She shook her head gently. Don't. I only did what I swore I'd never do again. What do you mean? Mae looked down at her hands, still faintly green from crushed leaves. I was a healer once, she said quietly. My husband, Isaac, fell ill. I tried everything. Nothing worked. Her voice caught,
then steadied. When he died, I buried that part of myself with him. I thought if I never touched it again, I wouldn't fail twice. She lifted her eyes to him. And then there was you. I couldn't stand by. I had to try.
Toma held her gaze. Even his weakness lingered in his body. He reached out, his rough fingers brushing hers where they rested on the quilt. If you hadn't, he said, I'd be gone. You didn't fail me. His grip tightened, weak but sure. You gave me back the breath in my chest. Mae's eyes filled with tears. I don't know if I can carry that weight again, she whispered. Toma's hand didn't let go. Then don't carry it alone. She went still. The words sank deeper than the fever ever had. The storm outside had passed days earlier, but in that room another storm broke, leaving behind something tender, fragile, and alive. They were no longer just two people sharing a house. They were survivors who had saved one another. By late summer, the land had hardened again. Storm grasses turned brittle. The washes dried to dust and stone. On the surface, ranch life slipped back into its quiet routine. Mae tended her garden, beans and tomatoes fighting the heat, while Toma rode the range. But beneath that calm, something simmered. It was no longer the tension of strangers. It was the tension of words unspoken, feelings crouched low in the corners of the room like coyotes waiting in the brush. The blow came on a Tuesday. Toma returned from Santa Cruz. Toma's face was dark as a thunderhead when he came through the door. He cried, If I can't show lawful claim, they'll review my right to this land. The government doesn't like a man holding acreage alone. Mae set the dish aside, her movement slow and careful. But this is yours, she said. You worked it. You built it. Toma's mouth tightened. Paper doesn't care about sweat. Silence filled the room, thick and pressing. Mae felt fear flicker in her chest, not only for the land, but for what it meant to him. This place was his fortress, his penance. And now he looked at it with the helpless fury of a proud man facing an enemy made of ink and law. Toma, she began. He stood abruptly. Leave it be, he muttered, and walked out into the yard. For 2 days the house fell heavy again. This silence wasn't easy or shared. It was strained. Toma sat on the porch for hours, staring into the stars, while the quiet scrape of Mae's needle and thread sounded too loud in the stillness. The breaking point came on a warm night in early September. He shook his head slowly. Truth is, I couldn't save them. And I don't know if I ever forgave myself for that. Mae's breath caught. She looked at his back and saw her own guilt reflected there. I know that feeling, she whispered. My husband died, and I was helpless. Her voice shook, but she went on. I told myself if I'd been wiser, faster, braver, maybe he'd still be here. People called me cursed. Maybe I believed it. Toma turned then. The rawness in his face startled her. Mae met his gaze and held it. And now, she said softly, I sit across from you, alive, because I broke that oath. And I think maybe I'm not cursed after all. The silence that wrapped the room wasn't empty. It trembled. Toma stepped toward her, moving slowly, as if each step demanded something from him. When he reached her, he stopped, hands clenched at his sides. Then they relaxed. I don't want to lose this land, he said quietly. But more than that,
I don't want to lose you.
Tears. It was the kiss of two worn souls, finally setting their burdens down, side by side. Later they sat together on the porch bench. The desert night stretched wide before them, scented with sage and cooling earth. Toma's arm rested along the back of the bench, Mae Calder close at his side. "Whatever the papers say about heirs," Mae said softly. "Maybe the land just needed two people willing to tend it together." Toma turned to her, his eyes steady in the moonlight. "And maybe," he said, "I just needed someone patient enough to wait." From the ridge, the silhouette of the wild Mustang stood watch. For the first time, to Toma's eyes, the horse looked less like a ghost and more like a promise. Autumn came to Lone Mesa with cooler nights, the desert air sharpening, the stars hanging crisp against the black sky. The long heat of summer gave way to winds whispering through yucca and mesquite. For the first time in years, the change of season felt like a promise instead of a loss. Toma and Mae slipped into a new rhythm, subtle but sure. She still rose early to set the stove alight. He still rode out to the stock. But now, when he returned, her smile was waiting. Now, when they sat down to supper, he reached across the table to lay his hand over hers. They didn't rush to name what they had. It didn't need naming. The land itself seemed to understand. One evening, Mae touched the cool bone, her fingers trembling. She lifted her eyes to him, steady and shining. "Are you asking me to stay?" she asked. Toma shook his head gently. "No need to ask. You already have." Word spread, as it always does in the West. When they rode into Santa Cruz for supplies, the folks of Santa Cruz noticed. They saw Toma, the solitary Apache rancher, walking beside a woman, Mae Calder, the widow who once carried whispers of misfortune. Some looked with curiosity, others with judgment. Toma quieted them all without raising his voice. When he introduced her to a neighbor, he did it plain and firm. "This is Mae," he said. "She keeps my house, and she keeps my heart as well." For the first time in years, Mae felt no shadow of shame trailing her. She stood tall in the light. Back at the ranch, the garden Mae planted grew strong. Near the porch, the yucca Toma had once given her burst into bloom, great white flowers opening bold against the desert sky. And as if the land itself were offering its blessing, the gray stallion, the wild ghost of the ridges, finally came down. One dawn, Toma found it standing calm by the corral fence. It didn't run. It didn't fight. It simply watched. Toma smiled, slow and genuine. "Looks like even the wild finds a place to belong," Toma said. Mae Calder slipped her hand into his. "So did we," she whispered. That summer, a child's cry rose beneath the endless desert sky, and Lone Mesa was no longer a land of silence and ghosts. It became a chosen home, a living home, one held by two souls who had carried grief, faced fear, and found, at last, the courage to love again. And that, my friends, is the story of Toma and Mae. It is a reminder that no matter how hollow a house may feel or how heavy the silence presses in, the heart can always learn to beat again. I hope you, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories from the frontier. Until next time, keep your fences strong and your heart open. Walk in peace, my friends. All stories are created for entertainment purposes and may include fictional elements or dramatized interpretations inspired by historical settings. We use AI tools, voiceover, visuals, scripts, as creative assistants. However, all content is reviewed, refined, and edited by humans to ensure emotional authenticity and storytelling quality. We fully comply with YouTube's policies regarding AI-generated content and do not use any deepfake techniques or misleading recreations of real individuals. All visuals and supporting materials are properly licensed. Sharing, re-uploading, modifying, or distributing any part of this content in any form requires written permission. We appreciate your support and respect for original creative work.